Hello, everyone. I would like to have you back here on campus. I think you had a great time at the square. Some people told me about it, and hopefully you had a good lunch. Now I'd like to talk about NATO's role in the new world. And before I start, I'd just like to briefly tell something about it. The last few years before the invasion in Ukraine, the NATO has been heavily criticized by its member states. Donald Trump called it obsolete. Countries like Germany were reluctant to increase government spending on military equipment, and even though countries like Poland demanded more expenditure, it hasn't happened much. But since the invasion started in Ukraine, it shifted heavily. And like Chancellor Olaf Scholz in Germany said, he called it a Zeitenwende. With those words, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Olivier Benoit. He's responsible for the participants from France and the western part of Switzerland. And moreover, he's responsible for the logistics here at the St. Gallen Symposium. So happy to have you here.
Thank you, Niklas. As you just said. As Niklas just said, I'm a member of the 51st International Students Committee, as well as a student at the University of St. Gallen. The recent events in Eastern Europe have been at the center of attention since February 24th. Expected by some, incomprehensible for others, we now stand at a pivotal moment for Europe, for Ukraine, for Russia, the world order, but most notably for the upcoming generation. Because the decisions of leaders of the world today will affect our generation. It is for this reason that cross-generational dialogue is now more relevant than ever. Our future is in the hands of leaders that may have long-term interests that are much different than those of the young generation. But it is us, future generations, who must live with their decisions and consequences of their decisions. In this session, our speakers will address the topic of how potentially gain the relevance and purpose of NATO in a world no longer defined by American unipolarity. Addressing, among others, the question, does this liberal institution have the responsibility to promote international stability and defend countries and people from acts of aggression no longer that are contrary to international laws and norms? I'm looking forward to present you our topic leader, Ali Aslan, an award-winning, internationally renowned TV presenter, event moderator, and podcast host. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome indeed. I'm Ali Aslan. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. It's wonderful to be here. This is actually my very first time at the St. Gallen Symposium. We've tried many times before, didn't work out logistically. Here I am, 2022 is the year where it finally happened. I just wish it were under better circumstances, because obviously, and this is what our topic will be about today, we are finding ourselves at a time when there is a war taking place in the heart of Europe. And NATO's role here is, of course, key. How is the alliance rising up to the occasion? How it has to evolve in the next few years? This is what we will discuss with our very distinguished panel. To my immediate left, she was, of course, the 4th president and the first female president of Croatia. She also served as the first female Assistant Secretary General of NATO. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Kolinda Grabar-Kitarovic. Lovely to have you.
Thank you.
The St. Gallen Symposium is a wonderful symposium, but of course the Munich Security Conference, I would argue, is arguably perhaps the best known think tank conference in the world that is ranked #1. It has been ranked #1 for many years in a row. And the fact that it is so popular, so relevant, is also due to our next speaker, our second panelist. Wonderful to have him here with us, the Vice Chairman and CEO of the Munich Security Conference. Benedikt Franke is here. And last but not least, of course, much of today's discussion will be about NATO, but it will also inevitably be about Ukraine. And I couldn't be more delighted to be welcoming a member of the Ukrainian parliament here today on stage to give us a sense of what her country is going through and how NATO possibly could help you. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Lisa Jasko is here with us. And Lisa, if you don't mind, let me dive right in and ask you. Obviously, we're talking a lot about the Ukraine. We're reading a lot about the Ukraine, and journalists like me are reporting a lot about the Ukraine. But someone who's actually from there, you are in touch with your relatives, with your friends, with your colleagues. Give us a sense. What is the mood? What is the morale on the ground there right now?
Well, first of all, thanks for welcoming me here. It's very important that I have an opportunity to address it today here, because I believe that the voice of Ukraine is very much needed in all the discussions that we may have and are having about the future of security of Europe. You know, before the war has started, we had lots of discussions about the future of the security of Europe. And we always were saying that the sanctions against Russia is needed, the NATO needs to have a better strategy of the security. But unfortunately, some things that happened came at a very high price for Ukraine. And on 24th of February, I myself woke up from the sound of explosions, from the bombing. We didn't know how does it feel like. And since that time, the life is very different, of course. I left Kyiv on the first week of the war. And since then, I'm staying in different parts of Ukraine and also traveling to Europe. But how does it feel? It feels very determined, but very painful. More than 50% of Ukrainian children are displaced. About the same number of families are separated because men are usually staying at homes and women with children are living to other places. And it's 72 days of war right now. And it feels that we are very united inside Ukraine. It feels that the world woke up, but we are still finding and seeking for solutions how to end this war. And this is very painful for all of us, for me personally, because every day there are victims. And I personally lost already some people I knew. And adjusting to this reality and even having the discussion with some, let's say, foreign politicians about a need for further solutions and very strong actions, for me is very questionable. How can we discuss that? We have to act. We don't have time for discussion. So this is what we feel, but we are very, I would say, there is very special spirit in Ukraine right now. I think it's very unique what we feel, that unity, and we are very passionate to protect our land. We are not afraid. We don't have that fears. And this is something that I think is very important to share, because there are so many risks every day, no matter where you are in Ukraine and what you do, people are not afraid. And they are giving their lives. And, you know, in our national anthem, we sing that we are ready to give our lives to protect our land. And unfortunately, it's how the reality looks like.
Madam President, listening to Lisa speak about the heroic resistance, the defiance on the part of Ukrainians, one cannot help but admire them, of course. There's no time. This is the time to act, she says. And the same, of course, goes for NATO. You, of course, after your stint as president of Croatia, you were Assistant Secretary General of NATO. You know the alliance inside out. Interestingly enough, before this war, not too long ago, NATO was somewhat controversial. I remember French President Macron calling NATO brain dead. The former US President Donald Trump was tinkering with the idea about leaving NATO. But now it's all a very different story, isn't it? Do you think that this war, as much as we wish it hadn't taken place, but do you think this war has renewed NATO's relevance and purpose?
First of all, let me express my deepest sympathy to everyone in Ukraine who have lost their dear ones and who are suffering from this war, and also to express my deepest respect for your courage, for your resistance, for your unity, and for fighting for your values and for your right to determine your own future.
Thank you.
You know, the question of the purpose of NATO, I got that a lot throughout my career, and I lived through a lot of it myself. First of all, living in communist Yugoslavia, looking at NATO from another side, fighting for Croatia's independence, standing up for our right to our own choices for Croatia to become a member state of NATO. And I will quote myself and many others who said that had Croatia been a member state of NATO, that we would never have been attacked, that there would never have been war in Croatia. When later I explained the purpose of NATO to the audiences around the world, it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy, especially until the year 2014, with the illegal annexation of the Crimea and the start of the Russian aggression in Ukraine. We were all lulled into the fact that, yes, we were bridging the divides in Europe. We were working towards having Europe whole, free, and at peace, and we would repeat for so many times. But especially with young generations who had not experienced war, in contrast to perhaps us in Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, etc., most young people, young generations, would take peace for granted. They were growing up during the time of NATO enlargement, which was actually expanding the space of security, but also a space of democracy and of values. And the fact that NATO was instrumental in providing for that space of democracy and peace of Europe kind of lost sight of its purpose. And when you invest into defense, it's like investing into insurance. You hope you're not going to need it, but when you do need it, you have to have it there. So I think that a lot of people woke up to realizing that, yes, we do need NATO, and we do have the structures in place. And NATO, I think the buzzword, the main leitmotif of NATO's existence ever since 1949 has been adaptation, adaptability. And NATO has been successfully adapting to the circumstances in the geopolitical environment and to many other systemic changes. I think that the issue was communicating that purpose with a lot of misunderstanding. And looking back at my own work, I think that we should have been a bit more inclusive in including, as much as we tried to also include young people, young transatlanticists, etc. But we needed to widen that debate to a lot of circles outside of the political military establishment, because NATO is not a military alliance only, it's a political alliance and alliance of values. It's a defensive alliance. So it is truly serving the purpose now of the defense and deterrence of allied territory, people, and resources.
Benedict, listening to Madam President talk about how NATO has been adaptable throughout the years. As CEO of the Munich Security Conference, you've seen your share and had to deal with your share of NATO Secretary Generals, but also Russian ministers. Of course, Vladimir Putin himself was a guest at the Munich Security Conference. And of course, the argument that the Kremlin is putting forth for this attack is exactly that expansion that's been threatening us, that NATO has been provoking this attack. Is there a shred of truth? Is there a shred of truth to this argument that you can see, or would you say there's absolutely no basis and truth to what the Kremlin is putting forth here?
Thanks, Ali. Just to tell you something, Ali and I have been friends for 10 years, and this is the first time we're on a panel together, and he promised not to ask a difficult question, and this is what I'm getting. I'm deeply honored to be here between two strong women from countries that are fighting or have fought for their freedom, coming from a country that has seen peace for a long time. We've grown complacent, and I'll hopefully get to answer a question on the Zeitenwende later on.
Of course.
But this is also my first time here at the St. Gallen Symposium, but it feels like I'm coming back. I helped to write the speech that Kofi Annan gave here in 2010. There is one sentence that stuck from that speech. It's about the University of St. Gallen and about the symposium, that greatness has nothing to do with bigness, which I think is still true, so congratulations to all involved in this. It's not true for NATO. Greatness does have something to do with bigness in the case of NATO. And I think the possibly one good thing that is coming out of this drama and tragedy in Ukraine is that it has changed the mindsets in both Finland and in Sweden. And they have finally woken up to the realities in their neighborhood, and it looks like they may actually be joining, that we may have both of them at least committed at the NATO summit at the end of June. And that shows, in a way, that NATO has something to offer, that we have something that is worth defending, and that NATO is the one institution that can actually help us defend. And obviously, I was just about born when the discussions happened about NATO expansion to the east. And there are all these contradictory statements, whether a promise had been made that NATO would never expand over a certain line. And I think that's totally irrelevant. It is totally irrelevant. It is up to countries to decide, as you've said, whether to join NATO or not. And if they believe that the benefits are greater than the cost and that the promise and the hope it brings is worth the trouble, then they should be joining. Naturally, at some point, there will be a geographical, we won't be the North Atlantic Treaty Organization at some point when India joins. But for the moment, I do believe that expansion is not only legitimate, it is necessary. And whether that has contributed to a perception in Russia is hard to judge. Do I believe that anything justifies what is currently happening in Ukraine? Definitely not.
And of course, I will come to you in just a moment talking about the Zeitenwende, of course. Lisa, I do want to bring you in here and talk about, of course, what has been said, what Madam President put forth. She was saying if Ukraine had been a NATO member, this attack would have never happened. Obviously, at the 2008 Bucharest summit, that promise, quote unquote, or at least the perspective of Ukrainian membership, NATO membership, was given. However, no roadmap, of course, along with Georgia, was given in this particular case. Do you think that NATO dropped the ball here? Do you think that NATO dropped the ball as far as bringing in countries like your own country, but also Georgia, into the mix here?
Well, in Ukraine, we always, the popularity of the idea of joining NATO rose dramatically in recent years. So I think the majority of population is supporting the idea that Ukraine should be a member of NATO and the EU, and the Euro-Atlantic integration is inside our constitution. And we always were told and we thought that the policies of open doors of NATO means that the doors are open. And as our President Zelensky said that, but once we actually approached that and started knocking on the door, it looked like the NATO doors are closed for us. Why? This is a very good question that I think we shall discuss, but we see that there is a fear from NATO countries, I would say not readiness to have united position on what to do with Ukraine. And we understand that, as you said, it's up to the countries to decide whether they want to become a member of NATO. We want to become a member of NATO, but we know that we won't be admitted now. And this is painful truth for us, but we've learned through it that we need to defend ourselves, by ourselves, but with assistance, of course, but not counting on some magic that might happen from external assistance. At the same time, I understand that NATO became much more united than ever. And this existential threat that exists now brought a completely new dialogue and narrative inside the alliance. And this is great. And I believe that this will shape the European future that we need so much, because we cannot be weak in Europe. We cannot count that there will be no war. Or we cannot count that there will be no challenges and everything will be peaceful, status quo, taken for granted. In Ukraine, we don't take our freedom for granted. We fight for it. And, you know, I'm 31, but I was born when Ukraine became independent. After that, we had two more revolutions. We had war, we had annexation, we had occupation, we had lots of things, and now we have this disaster, this horror, and every time already in my generation. And I belong, as I always call myself, the generation of independent Ukrainians. We already had, myself, like many fights for defending Ukraine. So I'm happy that the NATO is rethinking the role, because we need to be very united in this. And in the search for real guarantees for the future security, we don't want to have papers that they don't work. And as we understand, yes, the Budapest and other memorandums and agreements, simply they're just on paper. And there is no guarantees that it's going to work. That's why we have a right. We believe that we lost already so many lives. We cannot have any fears in speaking up the truth. Let's work on the real guarantees, not only for Ukraine, but for Europe, that we have the mechanisms of security that are working, not only on paper.
Agreements that not only work on paper, Madam President. Of course, Ukrainian neutrality was one of the key demands by Moscow, and ironically now even President Zelensky is admitting that NATO membership for Ukraine is probably not going to happen anytime soon. But the fear, of course, is that if at least the West does not embolden and rather strengthen Ukraine's defense mechanism, that it might embolden the Kremlin to move even further, move beyond Ukraine's territory. We're looking at countries like Moldova, and we're looking, of course, at the Baltic countries, all of them NATO countries. How confident are you about NATO's ability and perhaps more importantly, willingness to protect these countries if push comes to shove?
Well, first of all, let's get some facts straight of what we have been talking about. First of all, let's not call it NATO expansion, it's NATO enlargement. And this is nothing new that sort of just came up after the end of the Cold War. The open door policy is enshrined in Article 10 of the founding treaty of the Washington Treaty from 1949, where it specifically states that the members the nations can invite any European country to become a member state of NATO. So it's been there ever since the very beginning. This has been made very clear to Russia. When I worked at NATO, we also provided the guarantees that NATO enlargement is in no way aimed against Russia. On the contrary, what we wanted to do, as I said, create this space of security and peace in Europe, on the European continent. NATO has its geographical limitations that are defined by the founding treaty and by the later protocols on accession of particular member states. So obviously, well, at least until the charter or the founding treaty hasn't been changed, it will not be expanding into India or anywhere else in the world. But NATO certainly will be working with other countries in the world. As it is a regional organization, it has to have a global outlook. It has to, with all the understanding of Russia's perception of security, nevertheless, we have to be very realistic, and we cannot say that the enlargement of NATO was the cause of this aggression. It was only a pretext. If we blame NATO enlargement, then we're either naive or we're pushing Kremlin propaganda. Again, what the open door policy remains, and NATO is committed to Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all, to put it very simply. And NATO will defend every inch of the NATO territory. And that has also been made very clear, not only by political statements, but by action, as now, probably contrary to President Putin's expectations, we have more NATO troops on the borders towards Russia in our eastern nations. More than 40,000 troops now under direct NATO command. There are plans for more military presence, but also for other measures, because even though we're talking about sort of a resurrection of territorial conquest, what Russia has actually done is that Russia has challenged the rules-based order and the values, the international law by force. And it has created a new reality for NATO, but for the international community in general, together with the EU and the other countries in the world, we have to stand up for every country for their right to choose their own path. So whether Ukraine will be neutral or not, it's for Ukraine to decide. And when it comes to NATO membership, of course, the aspirant countries will decide whether they'll apply for it and start the process. And it's for NATO alone to take decisions on their membership. One of the elements that certainly NATO will be doing is looking not only at the borders, at territorial borders, but the so-called domain frontiers. So not just looking at the physical presence and the military action that we're facing and the military capabilities on land, air, and sea, but also domains such as cyber, such as emerging and disruptive technologies. And by that, I also mean communication, disinformation, the destabilization through other means, and working with our partners around the world to protect the values that NATO is founded upon and that we all share, and to sort of push for that so-called forward resilience, because we will be defending our countries based on our values, not just in the territory of NATO, but in other parts of the world.
Benedict's evidenced by the fact that we're talking about NATO here at the St. Gallen Symposium. There's a very vigilant, vibrant debate about defense in Europe right now, particularly in Germany, of course, a country that has been, at least post-World War II, been traditionally somewhat pacifist-minded, much to the dismay of Washington oftentimes. Now you have the Zeitenwende, which has already been mentioned. Chancellor Scholz is saying we're going to raise Germany's military budget by 100 billion euros. There's a very controversial, heated debate in Germany whether or not to supply Ukraine with heavy weaponry or not. What is your take? How's the German government faring in this particular regard? See, is this easy enough?
That's a good one. You've now asked the copyright holder of the Zeitenwende Begriff, because it was our report that we published just ahead of the federal elections that called for a Zeitenwende, and that came up with 7 recommendations, including the Sondervermögen, the special fund. And we're most grateful to the Chancellor, not only for having used our terminology and our recommendations, but actually doing what the Munich Security Conference has really called for ever since its inception in 1963. We've always said that Germany needs to share in the burden, that Germany needs to do its bit, and obviously with our rather difficult historical baggage, that comes with additional challenges. But I think the times where German politicians could hide behind the perceived unwillingness of our neighbors to let Germany lead, those times are over. If you go to Poland, if you go to France, they want to see more German leadership. People want to see the Germans actually standing up for the values that they mention in speeches and to have actions follow words. And so, I get asked all the time, do I think that Zeitenwende is real? And isn't the dithering around that you Ukrainians have seen from our government a sign that once again it's just words? I think you will see a Zeitenwende and you will see a more active German government, and you will see a population that has woken up to both the need for NATO and the need for higher national defense budgets. We still do have a discussion of whether and what counts into this defense budget. Is climate adaptation and mitigation, is that now part of increasing resilience? And is that part of protecting critical infrastructure? And is this thus part of a defense budget? We will have these discussions. But at least we have moved away from an addiction to pacifism to a more realistic worldview. And it's ironic that it's a government led by the Social Democrats, and it's ironic that it's a green foreign minister that is the most present embodiment of this Zeitenwende. And despite my own political preferences, I'm very proud of what they're doing, and I wish they had gone to Ukraine earlier, and I wish we had been clearer on the heavy weapons. But having seen how difficult and slow the discussion was over the last decade, there is a sea change coming. And it's for the better.
Sea change is coming, says Benedikt Franke-Lisa. That's something that should please you, at least the premise of it, the basis of it. How satisfied are you as a Ukrainian member of parliament with the level of support you've been receiving up until now from the so-called West, from the US, from Germany, from the EU, from NATO? Clearly, NATO has already ruled out in the very beginning there's going to be no boots on the ground. Article 5 does not apply here, as we firmly established. But beyond that, are you satisfied with the support that you have been receiving from the West?
Well, we clearly understand that support is unprecedented, and of course, we are very happy about it. But the timing of this support and the amount of this support is often wrong. And some things that might have helped us to prevent war had to happen like in February, but now only is that time when some countries finally made such decisions in terms of the assistance or like an embargo or sanctions, and this all happens in the cost of lives. And for us, it's very hard to agree that waiting is an option. We don't have time to wait. But in the same time, of course, I understand that for bureaucracy and for many countries who have not seen existential threats for many, many years, this is something very, very new. And I personally, well, in Ukraine, we have, I should say honestly, lots of criticism towards position of Germany. But I personally am in touch with some colleagues from the Bundestag, and I know there is so much progress. If we compare the discussion that we had in February and January, right now it's like completely different scenes in terms of the different kinds of assistance, but it takes time. The only thing that I'm afraid that it may take even longer for some bigger solutions. And also, since the world is very much focused now on Ukraine, but we also have challenges in other countries, in Moldova, in Georgia, in Balkan countries, like Poland. Let's look at that like in a system. It cannot be also just only about Ukraine. And here is maybe, like saying something not exactly for Ukraine, but I understand that the future of Ukraine is very much linked to the situation in other countries. So let's do it together, and let's not close the eyes on that. We may not have time to save that countries, and it's very important to urgently act with sanctions and with the other tools not to allow to have different tragedies also in that countries as well.
The urgency clearly comes through in your statement. So yes, I take it you are satisfied, but you wish this had been taken, the decisions had been taken sooner. Something that, of course, the Ukrainian ambassador in Germany is not shy to voice on a frequent level. But, Madam President, of course, even those who are very critical of Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin says one needs to tread very, very carefully here, because when we're talking about Russia, of course, we are talking about the country with the largest stockpile of nuclear warheads in the world. And he's already made it clear, bluffing or not, he's already made it clear that if push comes to shove, if he feels cornered, he's not going to be shy, he's not going to hesitate to use nuclear weapons against what he perceives to be foreign intruders. How likely is such a scenario? Obviously, this is a nightmare scenario that needs to be avoided at all costs.
Oh, absolutely. Russia has to be clear on the one thing, that a nuclear war cannot be won. It means absolute destruction. So yeah, I completely agree with Lisa. Yes, and I understand also. I was in the same situation when we were under embargo, arms embargo in Croatia, and trying to fight for our independence. I understand that. But on the other hand, I also have to say that we've acted a lot more quickly this time. And there are two crucial elements, I think, that led Putin to the wrong conclusion about how he was going to fare with the initial what he called that special military operation in Ukraine, with an attempt or the goal of bringing down the government in Kiev, and then taking Ukraine by basically controlling through a puppet government. He underestimated two facts. First of all, the courage of Ukrainians, and in particular young Ukrainians who identify themselves as Ukrainian and are fighting for their freedom and for their right of choice. He has underestimated the strength of the Ukrainian armed forces, who are much different from 2014, because NATO, as a matter of fact, has putting in, and NATO nations, a lot of funding and a lot of training. So the Ukrainian armed forces are much better, or were much better prepared than they had been in 2014. Another element that he miscalculated on was the resolve and the unity, the speed and the depth of our own reaction. NATO, the EU, and the rest of the world, he was probably counting on disagreements, on discords among us, but the way that we stood up together, that we stood with Ukraine, but also in defense of international law and the rules-based world order is really commendable. What we need to do is maintain that cohesion. Now, what happens next? Of course, NATO is not at war with Russia. We're not seeking war with Russia, none of us. We are doing whatever we can to de-escalate. What NATO and individual allies and other countries are doing is upholding Ukraine's right to self-defense by helping through financial, humanitarian, and military means. There was a bit of reluctance in the beginning in terms of trying to define what offensive and what defensive weapon systems meant. But with the scale of Russian invasion, the incredible destruction, the targeting of civilian targets, mass rapes, torturing of civilians, I think it became clear to everyone that Ukraine has to get that help in order to be able to uphold that right to self-defense, which is enshrined in the United Nations Charter. So this is a legitimate international legal right, and this is what we will continue to do. Of course, at the same time, really taking care that there is no misunderstanding, miscalculation. So we know that for years now, the relationship with Russia has been changing and deteriorated, and it has changed for the long term. And it will be one of the aspects of the next strategic concept, how to define not just the relationship with Russia, but really the overall geopolitical situation, and then China as well. So a lot of new considerations. However, I think that we've really awakened to the fact that we just cannot take the life as we've had it for granted, not only in terms of military aspects, but of values as well, as I said. So we are witnessing that systemic battle now in the world, systemic battle for not just resources, but also for values and for ideology. And our cohesion, maintaining the cohesion once these sanctions start hitting back our own societies, especially the energy crisis and the rising food prices, etc. It will be a challenge, but it will be of crucial importance.
Freedom and liberty certainly do not come for free, Benedict. I think that's very much clear. Madam President raised an important point, saying Vladimir Putin did not expect our resolve, our unity, at least on a NATO and EU level, a transatlantic alliance, and I think that's fair to say. But if we take a step back and we're looking at this conflict globally and the reactions globally, China obviously has been very critical of NATO enlargement, certainly has to be counted somewhat in Moscow's camp for the time being. India is staying neutral. We're talking 3 billion people right there out of 8 billion people. Count to that South Africa, Brazil. So on a global level, the judgment and the resolve is not quite as clear. How do we bring the rest on board? I was just in New Delhi at the Raisina Dialogue last week, where this was discussed quite vehemently and passionately. And do we make the mistake here in the so-called West that we are pretending or thinking that our positions are the universal ones?
Yes, we are making that mistake. And you know, there is a very interesting graph that I think the Economist published a couple of weeks ago. Where is Russian money for disinformation flowing? And you see quite clearly, they've sort of given up on Western Europe. It's going to South Africa, it's going to Indonesia, it's going to India. And if you do surveys there, they see this war in a totally different light. I mean, you know, in Europe, it's about the brave Ukrainians defending freedom. In South Africa, this is seen very differently. And so we need to be careful. And I think what is absolutely telling was the UN General Assembly vote taken on the Russian invasion, where, yes, only 5 countries voted in favor of Russia. That was obviously Russia and Eritrea, North Korea, Syria, and Belarus. I mean, you know, let's forget about those for a moment. What is really important to understand is that 35 countries abstained. And those 35 countries are the countries that we need to look at and we need to engage with much more intensely. We need to pull them over the line. We need to, you know, I'm not talking about regime or systemic change, but I'm just saying those countries have made, for whatever reasons, and the reasons are very different, some are financial, some are political, some are ideological, a decision not to vote against Russia at this one time. And I think if you know, you've counted a couple like China, like India, South Africa, they're all over the globe. And it needs to be part of our work, diplomatic work over the next decade, to pull them into the camp of the liberal international order, where it's a no-brainer to vote against Russia or anyone else that invades another country and commits the atrocities that are being committed on a daily basis. So I think that the point is quite clear that Madam President, as always, is right, that Putin was absolutely surprised by our cohesion. She's also right by saying we need to maintain that. And I think that is both an internal challenge and an external challenge. Internal, we need to overcome westlessness, is what we've called, and helplessness, what we've put out there. But we also need to pull more of the undecided into our camp.
Time is running fast in this very fascinating panel. We only have 15 minutes left. 15 minutes I want to use to bring 2-3 questions here in from the audience. Lisa, before I do, just perhaps quickly, the resolve on the part of Ukrainians is very evident. Every day, President Zelensky and other politicians, such as yourself, come out and say, we will win this. We will fight until the end. But at some point, negotiations will have to take place. At some point, Vladimir Putin, assuming he will be in office, will be sitting across from President Zelensky, whether it's in Istanbul, Zankalan, or someplace else, and making these decisions. I I've interviewed former President Poroshenko a couple of weeks ago, and he said it's going to be very tough after the humanitarian suffering that Russia has imposed on us in Bucha, other places. We will never forgive them. It's going to be a tough decision to make, no?
I absolutely agree. It's not possible to forgive right now. And at this point, I don't see any willingness from the Russian side to have also any kind of deal. So when we are approached and someone says to us, why don't you make a deal with Russia? Like, let's be honest, is there any possibility for that? President Zelensky is saying every day, I'm ready to meet Putin. Let's do that. But Putin doesn't want that. Putin wants to continue killings and then occupation and invasion because he believes then we will get tired, more people will be killed, thousands more, and then he will get all of that without any agreements. He doesn't need that. I'm sure that there cannot be any compromise in the human life and the territory. Whether Putin will be in power at the time when any kind of agreement will be needed, we don't know, let's be honest. And we know that, unfortunately, the Russian society is supporting Putin, majority, but still it's not that stable. It's not that comfortable for Putin anymore. So we don't know what exactly will happen in Russia itself. And for us, it's very important to continue this battle for our freedom because with our example, we show also to other nations and societies that it's possible to win that freedom, to defend that freedom. But talking about the forgiveness and reconciliation, I think we are very far from that. First, we need to end this war. We shouldn't see Russian troops in Ukrainian land. We should have international guarantees and possibly new forms of alliances that will provide us guarantees not only on paper, but in the reality. And it will be not only about Ukraine, but also about other countries. And then let's see what kind of situation Russia will have. I think that the evil cannot last forever. Nazi Germany couldn't exist forever, and there is a price, and I'm sure that there will be a price for that war criminals and war crimes that Russia is committing right now.
And I'm hearing you are seeing this clearly, please. And I'm hearing you do see this as Russia's war against Ukraine and not, as some people say, Putin's war against Ukraine, implying that he does have the backing of the Russian people. This is your sense?
Unfortunately, yes, because Russian people were prepared, brainwashed for many, many years, and they believe that there are Nazis running around and that the NATO is creating chemical labs around Europe and in Ukraine, in Mariupol, and they think that it's possible to use nuclear weapon just to destroy the NATO efforts. Unfortunately, this is what we hear from ordinary Russians, and that's very scary.
Mm-hmm. Let's take some audience. We only have 50 minutes left. What I will do, because I'm already seeing quite a number of fans, perhaps we'll collect them. If I could ask you perhaps to take some notes, and then we'll get them. The first row, the lady here in the first row has had her hand up. I'm coming to you bit by bit, trying to get in 3-4 questions. And we'll collect them. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Oksana. I'm from Ukraine. I'm also leader of tomorrow of this symposium. And I'll have a question to Madam President. But first, I would like to briefly, give, an explanation to the audience so that they would understand why I'm asking this question. So Ukraine was a neutral state when we came out of the Soviet Union in 1991. And when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and started its intervention in the eastern part of Ukraine, we pledged to have a NATO and EU membership as state objectives. And this is why I want to get back to the events of 2014, right? We saw a lot of European leaders, they condemned Russia's annexation of Crimea. But at the same time, they continued developing, especially economic relationships with Russia. We saw Germany, making partnership on establishing major gas pipeline, right? So the question would be, do you think if the so-called West would be much stronger in its response to Crimea and to Donbass in 2014, the war would not take place? or it would be still inevitable in any case? Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to discuss this, whether a more robust response in 2014 would have prevented events that we're seeing today. This gentleman here in the middle, please get up so she can see you.
Hello, thank you so much for your contributions. I have a question for Madam President as well. I am a PhD student at the University of Glasgow, and my question is linked with the bilateral defense pact between Greece and France. We have two NATO countries that a few months ago decided to proceed to a more tight defense partnership. And my question is, first of all, why they did it, since they are transatlantic partners, and they are part of the umbrella. And the second one is if this is a threat to NATO's coherence and stability. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Let's see. We have all the way in the back so that I'm not being accused of... I am nearsighted, but...
Thank you very much to our speakers. Very much enjoyed the discussion and some of the things you've highlighted. My name is Zamzam Ibrahim. I'm one of the leaders of Tomorrow also. I'm from the UK, if you can't tell from my accent. One of the things I wanted to ask and highlight is a question and maybe a reflection on some of the things that have been shared. And my question really is as Europeans, are we naive to what safety and security looks like in a globalized world? One of the things that was mentioned yesterday by one of the moderators actually was that we couldn't have imagined a country that has a McDonald's being bombed. And in actual fact, Syria had McDonald's and was bombed. And I think understanding what actually safety and security looks like to us as Europeans, but in a globalized world, isn't that are we living in a false dichotomy in the sense of like naive to the realities of what security should look like? I guess that's anyone in the panelists that wants to answer that question.
Thank you so much. Let me look to the final round. This gentleman has had his hand up here for quite some time. Let's bring him in also, and then let's throw it back to the panel.
I am Sudhir Jalan from India and wanted to give you a different perspective. Today it is admitted that NATO was found sleeping and at the cost of the Ukrainian. Had they taken actions earlier? Now let it be a warning. A greater enemy lurks in the way of China. Are we getting prepared for their attacking India? I'm trying to put the panel to think ahead, maybe a few months, few years.
All right, thank you so much. Madam President, let's start with you. A couple of questions were addressed to you directly.
Yes.
Let's start with the one in 2014, perhaps.
2014,
yeah.
Well, since I'm not an official right now, I can tell you on my own behalf that I was quite disappointed at the time by our reaction. It took us a long time to come up even with a press statement condemning what was going on in the Crimea. And yes, there were a lot of economic considerations underlying that decision, but I think also fear of escalation and, you know, perhaps not thinking about geopolitical considerations that much. And also, I will go back to what Lisa mentioned, I think, which is very important, not just Moldova and Georgia and other countries to the east of us, but you know, looking at my own neighborhood in the so-called Western Balkans or Southeast Europe, I think that there is a real danger of things flaring up. And, you know, going back to the question of China now, connecting these two things, China for NATO is not an adversary, but it is a force to reckon with. With its coercive policies, certainly it has come on NATO's agenda, and it will be part of the next strategic concept. The relationship with China and this global environment. Now, what I would expect of China, and we were talking, you know, why some countries abstained. Perhaps not being close to this aggression and not being able to empathize completely because it's not close to your own home. Nevertheless, what we're defending here is the principles of international law. Whether we are aligned liberal democracies or others who define the rules-based international order in another way, we nevertheless all stand on the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the inviolability of internationally recognized borders. And China was an ally to Croatia when we were fighting for the recognition and for reintegration of occupied parts of Croatia. So what I would hope from China right now is to stand on these principles and to argue with Russia, actually, to stop the war, or with President Putin. We have to keep in mind that the Russian population are under heavy disinformation as well. So to urge Putin and the Russian leadership to stop this aggression, to pull the forces out and to really sit down to find a negotiated solution in good faith, not buying time. Certainly China, on the other hand, we have to talk to China about these issues, but also, of course, dialogue, again, at this point is not an option with Russia, but we still have to engage both countries in talking about the pressing issues of climate change, of the pandemics, and everything else that we're all facing and that we all have to face together. So whether the war could have been stopped in Ukraine, it's a hypothetical question right now. But again, it was premeditated, it was long planned. Some of us were pointing to the situation in Ukraine and what was going on, and now are pointing to other parts of the world. Now, with the question about Greece and France, I really can't talk about their motivation, etc. What I can say is that any cooperation is welcome. NATO is an alliance of sovereign states, so NATO never comments on particular issues within a certain country. But there is also a lot of talk about the European Union and the capabilities. What I think is right is to continue to build. We shouldn't duplicate the structures, but we should build the capabilities and really provide for the European side of the transatlantic alliance to step up to the plate and to be able to build capabilities in all of the domains that I have mentioned so far, including cyber, artificial intelligence, emerging technologies, disruptive technologies, etc. So there is a lot of work to be done. And there was another question, I forget, sorry, I didn't.
That's all right, maybe in the meantime, Benedict, indeed, so perhaps the question from the young student in the back about naivete on the part of the so-called West on Europe. I hear a lot when I travel also, not just naivete, but also double standards. They're saying, you know, the amount of time you're spending on Ukraine, you never did on Yemen, never did on Syria, never did on any other African conflicts. Is there some truth to the argument?
Certainly, and I'm not sure if we're naive about McDonald's and bombs. I think we should be glad that we're finally in a time where having a McDonald's is no longer a sign of anything. Neither good or bad perpetrators have McDonald's, victims have McDonald's. So the lines have become more blurry, is what I'm trying to say. And that makes being naive, unfortunately, a little easier and a little more tempting. If things become complex, it is quite easy to sit back and just think about reactions rather than getting ahead of the curve. We at the Munich Security Conference, we try to shine a light on the complexity. You probably all know this famous saying, I think it's by Clinton, it's the economy stupid. No, it really isn't. It's everything stupid. And we all like to talk about a comprehensive notion of security. It has become really difficult. And in fact, freedom is not going to be defended only in the fields of Ukraine. It's being defended in cyberspace, in space, and all the other things. And we may not be naive anymore about tanks rolling across borders. We are still incredibly naive about our media being manipulated, about our internet being misused. And so, yes, we are naive, and I hope we get over it.
Lisa?
Well, I wanted to make a comment about the answer from the West on the Putin's occupations, because I believe it started not in Ukraine in 2014. I'm sure it started a long time before, and what things were done in Chechnya, what things were done in Georgia in 2008. There were no immediate sanctions on Belarus 2 years ago. And now what do we have? We see that there are air missiles and the Belarus cooperating with Russia. I'm sure that if the answer from the West was much stronger, I'm sure it could be possible to prevent this war. But it's not only about 2014. It's not only about Donbass and Crimea. And another comment I wanted to make is that please, let's not imply the logic of the common sense to Russia. They are really, like, Putin is really far from being healthy mindset. We cannot apply normal, like, standards of the dialogue on communication when the person already gone so far in such crazy approach. International law doesn't mean anything for him. So, I'm a member of the delegation to the Council of Europe, and we had so many discussions about that. But let's be honest, what is, we want Russia to be in the dialogue, but Russia doesn't care. So then other tools should be invented, and let's look at the truth, and let's not be afraid. I'm sure that the argument that is often used that someone provoked Putin, it's absolutely not true, because Putin is inventing reasons. And because this fits to his picture, and saying that, there is a fear that we will provoke him, he will do whatever he wants. The only language he understands is strengths and actions, and this is very important to understand. Showing fear is giving him opportunity to be pleased that he's stronger in his mind. So this is very important, not to have this fear. And this is my probably main message here that I want you to remember.
Don't be fearful at a time like this. Time's unfortunately already up, Madam President, but I would be remiss not to ask you, Secretary General Stoltenberg's term was just extended by 1 year due to the very extraordinary circumstances, but there's going to be a job vacancy at NATO at some point next year for the role of Secretary General. Not a bad thing to have on your resume, no?
I get that question a lot as well. This isn't something that's on the agenda right now. Let's stop the war first.
Let's stop the war, and let's perhaps have the first female NATO Secretary General next year to help stop the war. NATO's role in the New World Disorder, a topic that I'm afraid will be with us for quite some time. NATO has already said this war, in the worst case scenario, could last 4 years. Let's not hope so. Let's hope that the humanitarian suffering that your country, Lisa, is going through right now will end as quickly as possible, so that we can go back here next year, to 2023, here at the St. Gallen Symposium, meet here again and talk about peace and about refurbishing and revamping a new Ukrainian state. Kolinda Grabal-Kitarovic, Lisa Jasko, and Benedikt Franke, thank you so much. This is your applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you.